All right.
Welcome you all. Third temple, Akhenaten, Moses, Joseph, and everything that's contained therein. And I believe this is the seventh installment. And we have been working hard in bringing some new information to you regarding the correspondence between Hebrew religion and that of Akhenaten in Akhenaten. And so we're going to start out tonight with Allyson Gary and her report. Looking forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody for listening. I'm going to read some quotes from the book, The Moses Mystery, The Egyptian Origins of the Jewish People by Gary Greenberg. And it's about last week when we ended up, we had several theories, but Jackson says it's a shame that this doesn't quite jive with what's in the scriptures. Time-wise, well, I forgot when I reviewed this book earlier, I didn't give everybody the whole thing. And he has a very excellent explanation for all of that. So, with y'all's permission, I'm going to read directly from the book. It's starting on like page 124 and then on. Okay, it's titled The Permissible Time Frame. According to Exodus 1, after Jacob and his family moved to Egypt at the invitation of Joseph, the Israelites became, quote, fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them, end of quote. And there came to rule over Egypt a Pharaoh which knew not Joseph. This Pharaoh feared the Israelites, and to halt their growing power, he, quote, set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses, end of quote. During the period of enslavement, Moses was born. Hidden away at first, his mother set him afloat upon an ark and sent him down the Nile, praying that God would take care of him. The Pharaoh's daughter discovered the child and raised him as her own in the royal household. As an adult, Moses interfered with the punishment of a Hebrew slave and killed an Egyptian guard, then fled from Egypt for his safety. The Bible doesn't say how old he was at the time, but rabbinical tradition said he was 40. Eventually, Moses returned to Egypt, confronted the Pharaoh, and liberated the Hebrews. The Bible doesn't explicitly say how old Moses was when Israel left Egypt, but since Deuteronomy says that after the Exodus he wandered for 40 years and that he died at the age of 120, we can easily conclude that the Exodus occurred in his 80th year. According to our chronological reconstruction, Joseph's death occurred at the onset of the co-regency between Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. When the text says the Pharaoh knew not Joseph, it implies that the monarch who came to the throne must not have been alive during Joseph's lifetime. That eliminates Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh in question, since he was alive during the latter part of Joseph's generation. The period of persecution, therefore, could have started no earlier than the reign of Thutmose IV, successor to Amenhotep II. Amenhotep had a high year mark of 23, since there is no evidence of a co-regency between him and his successor, Thutmose IV, couldn't have come to the throne earlier than about 1430 BC. If the Exodus took place in the 80th year of Moses, then it couldn't have occurred any earlier than 1350, which, according to our chronological reconstruction, falls during the reign of King Tut. I can't pronounce that one. At the closest end of the timeline, we have the Merneptah victory, or Israel stela, which requires that the Exodus preceded Merneptah's reign. In our reconstruction, Ramesses II came to the throne in 1304, which places the start of Merneptah's reign at about 1237. This leaves a period of about 113 years during which the Exodus might have occurred.
Now, wait a minute.
Sorry?
Just to remind everybody, the Merneptah stele contains the name Israel. Israel's seed is no more. So that's the first and one of the only ones from that period that where you find the actual name Israel as a nation. Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
Just had to
that's
get that in there.
no, thank you. That's perfect because that gives us an absolute end time for the time of the Exodus. It has to have happened before that, and I left that out. Okay, the only possible wait a minute. This leaves a period of about 113 years during which the Exodus might have occurred, 1350 to 1237 BC, and limits the period of oppression to no more than 193 years. The only possible pharaohs who could have been on the throne at the time of the Exodus were, in order of service, to Tutankhamen, I, Horemheb, Ramses I, Sethos I, and Ramses II. Ramses and Pithom. For most scholars, the reference in Exodus to the Hebrew slaves working on the Egyptian cities of Ramses and Pithom provides the chief evidence for the identity of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Historians generally agree that these two cities correspond to the Egyptian cities of Pi-Ramses and Pithom. The history of Pithom is not well known, but it was in existence at least in the time of Merneptah and presumably much earlier. Pi-Ramses, however, received that name during the reign of Ramesses II. Since this city was named by Ramesses II, scholars argue that this proves Ramesses II must have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. If the author of the phrase referring to the city of Ramesses participated in the Exodus, then the event must have happened in the reign of Ramesses II. His is the only reign before Merneptah in which that city had that name, and as already noted, Merneptah had to have come to the throne after the Exodus due to that stele. Despite the wide support for this argument, it is flawed. The city of Ramses existed prior to Ramses II, but under a different name. Many Egyptologists believe that it was originally the city of Avaris, the Hyksos capital dedicated to Set, a deity that was particularly important to Ramses II and his son Sethos I, he's named for Set. Under these circumstances, the reference to the city of Ramses could be anachronistic, written after the Exodus by a scribe using the name existing at the time of the writing rather than the one used at the time of the event. There are many such anachronistic references in the Bible. For example, in Genesis, when the Canaanite kings captured Abraham's brother Lot, the patriarch raised an army, quote, and pursued them unto Dan. But that territory wasn't known as Dan at that time. It only received that name after the Exodus, presumably when the tribe of Dan moved into the area. In this regard, we should also note that if the Exodus happened shortly before Ramses II took the throne, as argued below, the author of the passage could have participated in the Exodus when the city of Ramses had its former name and been alive when the city changed names, and he might have used the new name when writing his history in later years. In addition, when we study the Egyptian version of the Exodus story, written by Manetho and preserved by Josephus, we will learn that Moses and his followers were confined to the city of Avaris, the very city that most Egyptologists identify with Ramses. 1 Kings 6:1 says, this is the Solomon date, quote, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon reign over Israel, he began to build the house of the Lord. End of quote. Judges 11:26 adds that Jephthah, a judge of Israel prior to the period of the kings, performed his office 300 years after the Exodus. Unfortunately, new archaeological evidence contemporaneous with the time of Solomon proves that this king ever existed. Nevertheless, historians generally agree that he became king between 970 and 950 BC, approximately, even though biblical chronology dates the 4th year of his reign to 1017. If 950 were the date of Solomon's first year, adding 480 years to the 4th year of his reign gives an Exodus date of about 1426. Allowing for a little wiggle room due to the uncertainty of the actual starting date, we arrive at about the start of Thutmose IV's reign. But as indicated above, this date could be at best only the beginning of the period of persecution, not the date of the Exodus. Using the earlier starting dates for Solomon would be even more objectionable. Since this 480-year period places the Exodus close to Tutmos III, Amenhotep II, or Tutmos IV, most scholars find the 480-year claim implausible. Instead, they argue 1 Chronicles 6 shows 12 generations from the Exodus to Solomon. This, they maintain, indicates that 480 years was not meant literally, but rather symbolized the time elapsed by 12 generations. But, the argument continues, 40 years are too long for a generation, and a more realistic 25 years should be substituted, making the total time span 300 years and dating the Exodus between 1270 and 1250 BC, right where the majority would like it. The problem with this theory is that there is no biblical reference to a generation lasting 40 years, 25 years, or any other number. The proponents of this position decided how many years prior to Solomon they wanted to date the Exodus and to divide the total by 12. This approach proves nothing about the date of the Exodus. The argument only means that advocates of this view would like the Exodus to fall in the reign of Ramesses II, and despite the absence of proof, the proponents simply declare it so. The sojourn date. Exodus 12:40 through 41 says, quote, "The sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all of the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt," end of quote. Read literally, the phrase children of Israel refers to the house of Jacob and implies that the sojourn began sometime during Jacob's lifetime. Since Jacob and his family didn't move to Egypt until 1525 BC, Joseph's 39th year, the passage implies that the sojourn began in that year. Others could reasonably argue that since Joseph was one of the children of Israel, the sojourn could have begun with his arrival in Egypt in his 17th year, 1547. Counting 430 years from either of those dates indicates an exodus in either 1117 or 1095 BC. Neither date is acceptable. Not only do they conflict with the Merneptah Israel stela, which gives a latest possible date of 1237 for the Exodus, they require that we eliminate the entire period of Judges and jump straight from the Exodus to the Hebrew monarchy. The 430-year sojourn also runs into problems with some other biblical data. The generations from Jacob to Moses are Jacob, Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Moses. Levi lived 137 years, Kohath 133, and Amram 137 years. In addition, according to Genesis 46:11, Levi and Kohath came into Egypt with Jacob. This means that the sojourn can't encompass more than a part of the lifespan of Kohath, all of Amram, and 80 years for Moses. Assuming that Kohath arrived in Egypt as an infant, Amram's birth happened in Kohath's last year, and Moses' birth occurred in Amram's last year, the maximum period for the sojourn would be 350 years, not 430. In addition, a sojourn of 430 years conflicts with the biblical allegation of 400 years of slavery. The sojourn began in either Joseph's 17th or 39th year, and the period of slavery begins after the death of Joseph. Since Joseph lived to the age of 110, there must be a gap of at least 71 years between the sojourn and the onset of bondage. This means that if the sojourn lasted 430 years, the bondage could have lasted no more than about 360 years, not the 400 years indicated elsewhere. Alternately, if the bondage lasted 400 years, the sojourn must have lasted at least 471 years. As early as the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Jewish scholars recognized a problem with this 430-year sojourn and began to reinterpret it. The traditional belief developed that the sojourn dated not from the arrival of Jacob in Egypt, but to the arrival of Abraham in Canaan, which incidentally is the very same year Abraham also sojourned to Egypt. Josephus, for example, a member of the priestly family with access to the sacred books of the Jewish people, as well as a historian, wrote that the Exodus occurred 430 years after the coming of our forefather Abraham to Canaan. Jacob's migration having taken place 215 years later. In other words, there were 215 years from Abraham's arrival in Canaan and also in Egypt to Jacob's arrival in Egypt, and 215 years from Jacob's arrival in Egypt to the Exodus. This idea did not originate with Josephus. It appears even earlier in the writings of Demetrius, a Hellenistic Jew who preceded Josephus and attempted to write a complete and detailed chronological history of ancient Israel. He too noted that there were 215 years from Abraham's arrival in Canaan to Jacob's arrival in Egypt. Then, citing figures for the ages of Kohath and Amram when they became fathers, he demonstrated that there were 215 years from Jacob's arrival in Egypt to the Exodus. Unfortunately, his evidence contradicts the Bible. In his account, Kohath was born the year Jacob died, after 17 years in Egypt. Genesis 46:11, however, says that Kohath was among the children of Israel who arrived with Jacob in Egypt. While the Genesis chronology clearly shows that 215 years elapsed between the arrival of Abraham into Canaan and the arrival of Jacob in Egypt, where did the 215 years in Egypt come from? Other than this late rabbinical interpretation that the sojourn began with Abraham instead of Jacob, there's no evidence in the Bible for a 250-year Egyptian sojourn. And as the Demetrius evidence discloses, these late scholarly interpretations relied on extra-biblical data that contradicted the biblical text. However, even if we accept the idea of a 430-year sojourn beginning with Abraham, that view also contradicts the claim that there was a 400-year period of bondage. If the maximum period of time during which Israel remained in Egypt was 215 years, and 71 of those years occurred during Joseph's lifetime, the maximum period of slavery could only be about 145 years. That the Hellenistic Jews remained confused about the sojourn chronology is evidenced by Josephus. While in one instance he accepts the idea that Israel was in Egypt for only 215 years, he elsewhere embraces the claim that there were 400 years of bondage in Egypt. Both propositions can't be true. Another problem with starting the sojourn when Abraham arrived in Canaan is that the text identifies the sojourn with the children of Israel, a term that refers to the children of Jacob, all of whom were born well after Abraham died. However, if we recognize that by the time of the biblical redaction, the term children of Israel had become an idiomatic expression for the Hebrew nation, the phrase could have been maladroitly used to describe the Hebrew nation at the time of Abraham, who was considered its father. Since Abraham arrived in Canaan in his 75th year, we can date the event to 1740 BC. So if the sojourn lasted 430 years from that date, the Exodus would have taken place in 1310. Interestingly, that date falls only 5 years later than the Exodus date proposed in the arguments below, and is consistent with the Atenas theory set out in the beginning of this work. Whether the 1310 date can be trusted, we'll have to wait until we look at additional evidence. Okay, then we have the bondage date. The most important piece of evidence occurring concerning the Exodus date comes from Genesis 15:13 through 16, which sets forth God's prophecy to Abraham. Quote, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." End of quote. Biblical scholars almost unanimously accept that this prophecy refers to the Egyptian enslavement of the Hebrews following Joseph's death. They identify the strange land as Egypt and interpret the prophecy to mean that the Exodus will come after 400 years of bondage, when the power of the Amorites in Canaan has peaked. This passage presents many problems. To begin with, despite the claim of 400 years of bondage, we've already seen that based on the Genesis chronology in the Reinterpreting, the period of slavery has to be less than 113 years. Also, since we have already indicated that the bondage could have started no earlier than about 1430 BC, a 400-year period would give a thoroughly unacceptable exodus date of 1030 BC or later, during the Hebrew monarchy. From the discussion above, we should also recall that a claim of 400 years of bondage conflicts with the other biblical claim of a 430-year sojourn. In addition, in one place, the prophecy talks of a departure from the strange land after 400 years, and elsewhere a return to a homeland in the fourth generation, as if both events were one and the same, and the 4 generations lasted 400 years. Spicer notes that the Hebrew word translated as generation has a primary meaning of time span, and that generation is only a secondary interpretation. The context, he orders, doesn't permit the reader to know which sense of the word to use. Spicer attempts to discredit this passage for the purpose of dating the Exodus, but his argument strikes me as off the mark. If the primary meaning of generation describes an undefined period of time as an age or duration, why refer to 4 such periods? It makes no sense. Unless there is some definable boundary between each period, the number 4 is superfluous. As long as the time period is undefined, 4 periods in one mean the same. The enumeration of a specific number of such periods clearly implies that the secondary meaning of generation is intended. In their attempt to reconcile the 4 generations with 400 years, biblical scholars observe that Moses is in the 4th generation after Jacob. Jacob, Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Moses. Unfortunately, the text indicates that his return is in the 4th generation, which would be Amram, not after the 4th generation, which would be Moses. Not only that, the prophecy seems to suggest that the return will be to Canaan, and Moses died before the Hebrews entered Canaan, failing to fulfill the prophecy even if we extend it to the 5th generation. Also, as we have already shown, the genealogy from Jacob to Moses allows for a maximum of only 350 years in Egypt, and that's only if you accept both the very long lifespans of Kohath and Amram, and that they fathered their children only in their last years. Sorry. Lost my place. All right. Still, another difficulty concerns the need for the Israelites to wait for the iniquities of the Amorites to end. Why should that be necessary? A God mighty enough to bring Egypt to its knees, the most powerful nation in the known world, shouldn't have much difficulty subduing the fading remnants of Amorites in Canaan. Understanding the prophecy. The prophecy describes 2 events: 400 years of affliction in a strange land, and a return to a homeland after 4 generations. Biblical scholars has always assumed that the return was from Egypt to Canaan after a period of 400 years of slavery in the strange land of Egypt. Given the present form of the text, it's not easy to disagree with such an interpretation. Nevertheless, I would like to suggest an alternative. 1. The departure after 400 years and the return in 4 generations describe 2 separate and distinct events. 2. The strange land was Canaan, and not Egypt. 3. The affliction in the strange land refers to what the Hyksos kings from Canaan did to the people of Egypt. The return in 4 generations referred to the return of a Theban ruler in Lower Egypt after the expulsion of the Hyksos. 5. The 4 generations were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. 6. The iniquities of the Amorites refers to the Hyksos domination in Egypt. 7. The reference to 400 years of affliction mistakenly combines 2 separate and distinct afflictions, one referring to what the Hyksos kings from Canaan did to the people of Egypt, and the other to what the Egyptians did to the followers of Akhenaten. The 400 years of Abraham's seed began with the birth of Abraham's son Isaac in 1715 BC, and point 9, the Exodus occurred 400 years after Isaac was born in 1315 BC. Implicit in this scheme is that the biblical redactors made a major error in transcription. I believe that by the time the Bible achieved its final form, somewhere well after the Babylonian captivity in 587 BC, the Hebrew scribes, immersed first in Babylonian and then Persian culture, lost close touch with their Egyptian roots. They had come to identify Egypt only with the oppression that triggered their departure, and had come to believe that they were primarily a Semitic-speaking Canaanite Mesopotamian people who had lived only for a short time in Egypt. This led to a misunderstanding of older texts and resulted in erroneous accounts of what happened. In the case of the Abraham prophecy, the redactors saw two predictions about Abraham's family, both involving affliction and both involving movement to another territory. They mistakenly thought that both predictions described the same event and concatenated the two visions into a single prophecy. The key to reconstructing it is to recognize that originally, like the Genesis chronology, it was written from a native Egyptian perspective and describes events happening in Egypt. The strange land. The prophecy says that Abraham's seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Since the prophecy says that Abraham's seed will suffer affliction in that land, biblical scholars routinely identify Egypt, Genesis, and Exodus. However, routinely identify it as Egypt. Sorry, it's too dark in here to read. Genesis and Exodus, however, continually refer to Canaan as the land where they are strangers. In Genesis 17:8, where God makes his covenant with Abraham, he says, quote, I will give unto thee, to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, end quote. And in Genesis 37:1, the text reads, quote, and Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father, that is Isaac, the son of Abraham, was a stranger in the land of Canaan, end of quote. Also in Genesis 28:4, Isaac says to Jacob, quote, and give thee the blessing of Abraham to thee, and to thy seed with thee, that thou mayest inherit the land wherein thou art a stranger, end of quote. And about Jacob and his brother Esau in Canaan, we are told in Genesis 36:7, quote, for their riches are more than they might dwell together, and the land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle. And in Exodus 6:4, about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God says to Moses, quote, and I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage wherein they are strangers. Over and over then, we were told that Canaan was the land where the patriarchs were strangers. It is as if the author has gone out of his way to emphasize that point. On no occasion in Genesis or Exodus, other than in the proposed interpretation of the prophecy, does the text refer to Egypt as a land where the Hebrews are strangers. Egypt is usually referred to as the land of bondage, which is as it should be. According to Genesis, Jacob came to Egypt with less than 70 descendants from his loins. When Israel left Egypt, there were allegedly 600,000 Hebrew males. Prior to the Exodus, the only land ever really known by the Hebrews was Egypt. It was the only land where the children of Israel were not strangers. If Canaan is the strange land, as the Bible clearly indicates in all other relevant passages, then the affliction suffered must have something to do with Canaan, not Egypt. At the same time, if Canaan is the strange land, then it is not the land of return. How can this be? Abraham's sojourn in Egypt. According to the Bible, in Abraham's 75th year, God directed him to leave Mesopotamia and move to Canaan. In the very year of his arrival, the land suffered a famine and he had to move to Egypt. The 75th year fell in 1740 BC. Coming from Canaan, Abraham's arrival point in Egypt would have been the Delta in Lower Egypt. By about 1740, this territory had already experienced a rapid expansion of Hyksos power. Only a few years later, the Hyksos controlled much of the northern territory and boldly established their capital in Avaris. Egyptian literature describes the period of Hyksos domination as one of great horror and affliction. although the archaeological record suggests that the Hyksos were far more benign than the Theban propagandists would have it. In the Egyptian mindset of the 18th dynasty, the Hyksos were hated foreigners from Canaan, the land where Abraham and his seed were strangers, and the Hyksos era was one of Canaanite affliction. Genesis depicts Abraham as wary of the Pharaoh and fearing for his safety. He believed that when the Pharaoh saw his wife, Sarai, later named Sarah, the monarch would want her for his own and would have him killed if he knew that he was her husband. As a precaution, he directed Sarai to pretend to be his sister. Abraham's fears were warranted. The king saw Sarai and wed her. Shortly thereafter, the God of Abraham unleashed a series of household plagues to torment the Egyptian ruler, which led to a revelation of Sarai's relationship to Abraham. The Pharaoh was taken aback. He returned Sarai to Abraham, bestowed many gifts upon them, and ordered them out of the country. At this point, Genesis contains a strange and puzzling passage. In the King James Version and many other translations, the text reads, quote, "And Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot went with him into the south." End of quote. If Abraham went into the south, he did not go into Canaan. He went to Upper Egypt, where Thebes was located. Obviously, this presents a problem in biblical interpretation. Did Abraham go south to Upper Egypt or north to Canaan? In the Revised Standard Version and other modern translations, that same text is given a different twist. The phrase, quote, "into the south," has been replaced by the phrase, quote, "into the Negev." The Negev is the large desert area south of Canaan, but east of Egypt. The contradiction arises from the fact that in Hebrew, Neges means south, and the Negev desert is obviously named for the fact that it is south of Israel. Modern translators, recognizing that you can't get to Canaan by going into the south, assumed that the Hebrew phrase referred to the south, the Negev desert. However, the Bible does not use the Hebrew word Negev. It uses Negabah, which means southerly, not south. Abraham went in a southerly direction, not to, quote, the south. If Abraham went in a southerly direction to get out of the Pharaoh's country, he had to be going to a portion of Egypt that remained outside Hyksos' control, somewhere in Upper Egypt. In a chronological context, Abraham's movement from Lower Egypt in the north to Upper Egypt in the south serves as a backdrop to the conflict between Thebes and the Hyksos kings. Royal marriages served to cement treaties, and the story of the Pharaoh and Sarai suggests a literary motif about political machinations in the Hyksos era. We'll have more to say about this story in later chapters. The southerly journey represents an original remnant of the earliest version of the story, with Abraham as an Egyptian from the south rather than a Canaanite from the north. Sloppy editing may have caused the biblical redactors to overlook this clue to Israel's early roots. Then we go on to Abraham's birthplace. A question arises as to whether or not Abraham was ever outside of Egypt prior to his confrontation with the Hyksos king. Genesis implies that Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldees, although it never specifically says that he was. The text says that Abraham's father was born in Ur of the Chaldees, and that he left there with Abraham and the other family members to go to Haran, another Mesopotamian city. After moving to Haran, Abraham, as noted above, received directions from God to leave Haran and go to Canaan, where Israelites would become a great nation. Almost immediately after his arrival, they experienced a famine throughout the land, and Abraham moved his family to Egypt. That is all we know about Abraham's residencies before his arrival in Egypt. The entire claim, therefore, that Abraham was outside of Egypt prior to his 75th year is deduced from a few simple passages allegedly tracing his route from Ur of the Chaldees to Canaan. But Ur of the Chaldees is an anachronistic phrase that had to have been inserted into the text hundreds of years after the Exodus. It smacks of an effort by Hebrew scribes during the Babylonian captivity after 587 BC to identify with the cultural roots of their Babylonian conquerors, the Chaldeans. The term "of the Chaldees" refers either to Chaldea, a province of Babylon, or Babylon itself. The Chaldeans rose to prominence, in 614 BC when they defeated the Assyrians and made Babylon the capital of their empire. Shortly thereafter, they defeated the Hebrew kingdom of Judah and moved its leadership to Babylon. Spicer observes that the ancient and renowned city of Ur is never ascribed expressly in the many thousands of cuneiform records from that site to the Chaldean branch of the Aramean group. The Chaldeans, moreover, are late arrivals in Mesopotamia and could not possibly be dated before the end of the second millennium, nor could the Arameans be placed automatically in the patriarchal period. Yet the pertinent tradition was apparently known not only to P, but also to J. And even if one were to follow the Septuagint in reading land for the anachronism of the Chaldean would remain unsolved. It doesn't necessarily prove that Abraham didn't come from but it does prove that the original Genesis author could not have used the phrase of the Chaldees. The anachronism strongly suggests that redactors inserted the entire pre-Egyptian portion of Abraham's life in later times, more than 700 years after the Exodus. Another puzzling matter about Abraham's departure from Haran concerns the command that he go to Canaan at the height of a famine, when he would have to immediately leave Canaan and go to Egypt. If Abraham's presence in Egypt fulfills a divine plan, why doesn't he go there directly? Why should he need to first establish a brief and insignificant presence in Canaan? Alternatively, if his presence in Egypt isn't necessary to the divine plan, why doesn't he delay his departure until the famine is over? In truth, Egypt was the original locus of the early Abraham stories. Amorites and Hyksos. The Genesis prophecy indicates that it will take 4 generations before the iniquities of the Amorites come to an end. Biblical scholars suggest that God waited to deliver the Israelites out of Egypt until the power of the Amorites in Canaan had come to an end. I suggest that the Amorites mentioned in the prophecy were the Hyksos rulers in Egypt. The Amorites were an early Semitic-speaking people who inhabited the territory from Canaan to approximately Babylon. In the 3rd millennium BC, Babylonians called Syria and Palestine the land of the Amorites. By the time of the 18th dynasty, the Amorites formed just one of many tribes identified as inhabitants of Canaan. Spicer, commenting on the Amorite prophecy, says that the Bible uses the name Amorites both as a reference to specific people and as a general reference to the pre-Israelite population of Canaan. There is a third sense, however, in which such a name might have been used, and the one I think was originally intended in Genesis. It would be a reference to a specific subset of a larger group. For example, during the American Revolution, George Washington would have been fighting to end the iniquities of the Germans, where Germans would mean the royal court of England's German king, rather than the German nation or the inhabitants of Germany. Follow that? That's a little strange, but if you think about it, it makes sense. In the third sense, the iniquity of the Amorites would refer neither to the Amorite people as a whole, nor to the pre-Israelite population of Canaan as a whole, but to a small group of Amorites associated with evil. More specifically, given Abraham's chronological time frame and the dominance of the Hyksos over Lower Egypt and Canaan, the iniquity of the Amorites refers to the iniquity of the Hyksos, conquerors of Egypt, where the Hyksos formed a subset of the Amorites. Who the Hyksos were is something of a mystery. The name Hyksos originates with Manetho. Josephus says that in different manuscripts the word Hyksos has different meanings, shepherd kings in one, captive kings in another. This latter interpretation led Josephus to identify the Hyksos with the children of Israel. Gardner notes that many Egyptologists still cling to this view. Although there are sound linguistic grounds for both etymologies, he writes, neither one is true. He then translates Hyksos as, quote, chieftains of a foreign hill country, a usage that he says was applied from the Middle Kingdom on to designate Bedouin sheiks. This alternative translation is now widely accepted among Egyptologists, and Gardner notes its consistency with the Turin Canon reference to the, quote, chieftains of a foreign country. In line with Gardner's translation, chieftains from a foreign hill country, it's worth noting that at the time of the Exodus, the Bible identifies the Amorites as living in the Canaanite hills. In any event, whatever the origins of the name Hyksos, the contemporaneous Egyptians did not use it to describe the foreign conquerors. The Egyptian texts identify the Hyksos invaders by the name Amu, which approximately means Asiatics. While the meaning of the term Amorite in the Genesis prophecy is debatable, it is consistent with the description of the Hyksos kings. Both Amu and Amorite refer to the people of Canaan and Mesopotamia, and the Hyksos kings certainly came from that region. The fourth generation. The prophecy to Abraham says two things will happen in the fourth generation. First, there will be a return to some territory, and second, the iniquities of the Amorites will end. Consider then some coincidences. Abraham left Egypt while the Hyksos ruled there. In the fourth generation, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph returns to Egypt after the iniquities of the Hyksos have come to an end. Furthermore, Joseph's birth date coincides with the year in which the Hyksos suffered their last major defeat at the hands of the Thebans. If we recognize Egypt as the place of return and the Hyksos as the Amorites, then that portion of the prophecy about the fourth generation makes logical sense. Unfortunately, the way the text reads, it implies that Canaan was the land of the return. But the prophecy also implies that Egypt is the strange land, and as we saw above, it is Canaan that is always referred to as the strange land. Apparently, the biblical redactors substituted Egypt for Canaan and Canaan for Egypt. Such an error is understandable. By the time of the redaction, the tradition had already been established that the patriarchs were from Mesopotamia and Canaan. Therefore, any return home had to be to Canaan. Similarly, the strange land had to be somewhere other than the homeland, i.e. Egypt. Placing the prophecy in the context of Egyptian history enables us to restore its true meaning. The return was to Egypt. The Amorites were the Hyksos. Joseph constituted the fourth generation, during which times the iniquities of the Amorites came to an end. The prophecy in the Exodus. Despite the longevity attributed to the early patriarchs, it is unlikely that the original Genesis chronographer intended to equate 400 years with 4 generations, especially since most lived several centuries longer than 100 years. What appears to have happened is that the redactor fused two separate but similar stories of affliction. One story talked of the return, the other of the departure. The redactor assumed both journeys were to the same location, Canaan. As just explained, the one account about a return home in the fourth generation when the iniquities of the Amorites ended referred to the expulsion of the Hyksos in the generation of Joseph. In this story, the Hyksos of Lower Egypt, after some political maneuvering with rival kings in the territory, forced some northern nobles to flee to the south. Abraham and his family represented the departing Egyptians. In Abraham's fourth generation, his descendant Joseph returned to Lower Egypt, representing the reconsolidation of power under the southern kings of Thebes. The second part referred to the actual Exodus. In this story, the children of Israel living in Egypt were subjected to a period of affliction, and in the 400th year of Abraham's seed, they departed to a land where Abraham was a stranger, Canaan. The cause and nature of this affliction will be examined in the remaining chapters, but is separate from the Hyksos affliction and could not have lasted 400 years. The period of 400 years originally encompassed not the time of affliction, but rather the length of time between the birth of Abraham's son Isaac and the departure from Egypt. The redactor's confusion originated in the belief that the children of Israel were Canaanites, not Egyptians. In his mind, a return home meant a return to Canaan, and a strange land meant Egypt. Not familiar with the Hyksos conquest, the only affliction he knew of was that which led to the departure from Egypt. As a result, the two separate afflictions were thought of as a single continuous event, And in stitching together the narrative from diverse sources, he changed the places of origin and return so that they accorded with his own notions. Since Abraham's seed began with the birth of Isaac in 1715 BC, this would date the Exodus to 1315 BC.
Oh,
The
my.
Exodus. Is it good?
It's really good, but it really needs to be parsed.
Yes.
There's so much there. Probably we need to take that thing and go piece by piece through it later on.
Okay.
There's so much in there.
It is.
Yes, that's exactly the best way to do it, is to break that down time by timeline, all the way till you get into the promised land.
That's a great idea. Absolutely. It's just loaded. But you might as well keep rushing on through, because we're picking up a little here and there, but we're going to have to parse it.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I tell you, this fellow goes through it pretty much in depth, but some of it is sort of confusing when you're reading it in his theory. But if you read the little bits, and I may be able to relate them back to it, it does make sense. All right.
It sounds like it is we're going through, because one thing we can catch are the dates.
Yes.
We know what our target dates are, and in a very unique way, these dates for Exodus and so forth, we haven't come upon before.
Right. Okay, so I've got like 1, 2, 3, 4 pages of text yet to go, and we've already gone a whole bunch, so I think I can get done on this.
All right.
All right. Let me get some coffee. Hold on. Okay, the Exodus.
You need some amphetamines.
Yeah, well, that's what coffee basically is to me, so it's good. The Exodus, 1310 or 1315. We have previously shown that the 430-year sojourn in Egypt did not refer to a period of captivity in Egypt. Early on, the traditional notion developed that there was a 215 period in Canaan and a 215-year period in Egypt. According to this theory, the sojourn began with Abraham's arrival, either in Canaan or Egypt, in his 75th year, 1740 BC. This would indicate an Exodus date of 1310 BC, but we also have an alternative Exodus date of 1315 based on the 400th year of Abraham's seed. The two dates are only 5 years apart, providing a very close correspondence and suggesting the two dating schemes draw upon similar chronological information and traditions. One might want to reconcile this 5-year difference by arguing that the affliction ended in 1315 when Israel rose up in rebellion, and that it took 5 years of resistance before the Exodus occurred, but I suspect that the redactor simply made an arithmetic error in calculating the time between Jacob's arrival in Egypt and the Exodus, arriving at 215 years instead of 210. In support of this view, I note that many of the Hellenistic sources used chronological data that differed from the biblical information. Demetrius, for example, a highly influential chronographer, wrote, quote,
chronographer?
Chronographer, sorry.
Starts with
CH. Wrote, quote, now Joseph was at the time 17 years old, and he was sold into Egypt and had remained in prison 13 years, so that he was then 30 years old, and Jacob was 110 years, 1 year before which time Isaac died, being 180 years old. While it is true that Jacob's 30th birthday occurred 1 year after Isaac died, Jacob was 121 years old on Joseph's 30th birthday, not 110. And as we saw above, Demetrius also placed the birth of Kohath at least 17 years later than Genesis had it. In another example, Josephus, the highly influential Jewish historian, raised in a priestly family, gives Isaac's age at his death at 185 years, extending his life 5 years beyond the age given in Genesis. An interesting error given the 5-year difference between the two Genesis dates. And of course, we have Josephus' massive inconsistency about a 215-year sojourn in Egypt and a 400-year period of slavery there. All right. Artapanus, another classical historian, in his Concerning the Jews, gives Moses' age at the time of Exodus as 89 years instead of 80. Only in the late Hellenistic writings and teachings do we find the doctrine of 215 years in Canaan and 215 years in Egypt. Demetrius provides us with the only specific chronology about how a 250-year period in Egypt was determined, but his data contradicts Genesis evidence. The inconsistent numbers floating around among the Hellenistic writers of Jewish history, such as Demetrius, Josephus, and Artapanus, show that in this late time the Hellenistic Jews relied on a number of sources and traditions that differed from the Bible. Given the high reliability of the Genesis chronology versus the untested and undocumented sources of Exodus, the Genesis provided date of 1315 BC stands with greater authority than the Exodus provided date of 1310. Additionally, other clues in the Bible also indicate that the Genesis dating scheme is to be preferred. The Pharaoh of the Exodus. According to Exodus, Moses fled from Egypt after killing an Egyptian soldier. During his exile, the sitting Pharaoh died. At this point, God told Moses to go back to Egypt and liberate the Hebrew people. Although we are not told how much time elapsed between Moses' return and the Exodus, we're given to believe that it was a short period of time. Following the Israelites' departure, the Pharaoh chased after them, arriving at a place where they were trapped in front of the sea. God caused the waters to part, and, quote, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them to the midst of the sea, even all the Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, end of quote. Subsequently, the waters closed over the Egyptians and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all of the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. The text doesn't explicitly say that the Pharaoh drowned, but if all the chariots and horsemen went into the sea, one should reasonably assume that the Pharaoh rode in a chariot, joined in the chase, and drowned in the effort.
Hey, Allyson, can I say something real quick?
Sure.
Okay, the way I understood that, and if you go and if you listen to even what he was just saying there, it did not say that the whole Egyptian army drowned to death. He said all those that went into the sea, every last one of them that went in, they drowned. Okay? That does not mean this Pharaoh went in there, and that does not mean that the entire army even got in. It says they died.
Well,
so
he goes on.
Army was not destroyed.
Excellent point.
Yes. And I questioned that when I read this a little bit, but he goes on a little. Scientifically, we cannot accept that this incident is literally true, but we can understand it as a figurative description of events. From such a perspective, we may conclude that in the course of the Exodus, the Pharaoh died, indicating that he served only a very short term. Chronologically, this gives us a Pharaoh's death followed by a second Pharaoh's death a short time thereafter. So he's not really saying that that was literally, the Pharaoh drowned, but he said that chronologically speaking, he died during that reign and there's a second Pharaoh. The two possible Exodus dates, 1315 and 1310, place the event at the transition between the 18th and 19th dynasties. At this point, the king sequence is Horemheb, Ramesses I, and Sethos I. Horemheb is considered the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Ramesses I served only about 2 years, part as a co-regent with Horemheb and part as a co-regent with Sethos I. He had perhaps only a few months as an independent ruler. In the chronology adopted in our reconstruction of the 18th dynasty, Horemheb's reign ended at about 1315 BC, and Sethos I began at about 1314. Ramesses I overlapped the two. This coincides with the Genesis dating of the Exodus in 1315. The first pharaoh to die would have been Horemheb. This would leave Ramesses I as the monarch whom Moses confronted. He would also be the briefly ruling king who died during the Exodus. Sethos I would have been co-regent at the time. A particularly interesting coincidence that may have contributed to the image of a drowning pharaoh is that Ramesses I died at the start of a Sothic cycle, and the annual heliacal rising of Sothis signified the start of a flood season. Jackson, you know what the Sothic cycle is, right?
Explain that.
It's a star that would appear at a certain point on the horizon. I don't remember which star, but it would give you a very accurate date of when the flood season started. And they used it, it appeared every year. And it sometimes, they had a different kind of a dating in calendar, calendar issues, just like we do. But they used the star, and they called it a Sothic cycle.
I've read the term, but I never knew what it meant.
It also has to do with, it would move in the heavens, and I forget what the period is. It's a long period before it would come back.
Like 42,000 years or something
like that. 4,200 years. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's right. But it would come back to the same point every so often. So, if it's the start of a Sothic cycle, that would be, all right, here it is, and then 4,200 years it would have moved and come back. But mostly it just meant that when it appeared in that part of the sky, it meant that it was the start of the flood season. The entire Sothic cycle signified the harmony between the flooding of the Nile and the movement of the sun. Here is 1,460 years. I should have looked a little further. Coming only once every 1,460 years, the start of the cycle was an event of great religious import. The death of Ramesses I at the start of a Sothic cycle in 1314 BC and the association of a Sothic cycle with the fruitful flooding of the Nile Valley may have suggested a literary metaphor for the drowning of the Pharaoh and the flowering of Israel. Okay, Moses and Akhenaten. Dating the Exodus to 1315 has significant implications for the origins of Israel. Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, which means he could have been born in 1395 BC. Akhenaten came to the throne between 1375 and 1372, at which time Moses would have been just over 20 years of age. And also, the fellow I read last week, he thinks that Moses was Akhenaten's older brother, so that kind of fits with that too.
Mm-hmm.
We do not know Akhenaten's precise age at the time of his ascension, but the consensus holds that it occurred sometime between his late teens and early 20s. If Moses grew up in the royal household, as claimed in Exodus, then he and Akhenaten would have been raised together, receiving the same royal education, or perhaps even brothers. The date of Moses' flight from Egypt provides another interesting piece of evidence connecting him to Akhenaten. Although the Bible doesn't say how old he was at the time, rabbinical tradition agrees that he spent 40 years in the wilderness before the Exodus, making him 40 years old when he left Egypt. This would date his flight to 1355 BC, a date which divided the reigns of Smenkhare and Tutankhamen. Smenkhare was Akhenaten's successor and briefly served as co-regent with his predecessor. The end of Smenkhare's reign marked the end of Akhenaten's revolution. When Tutankhamen took the throne, Atenism fell into disrepute. That a counter-revolution took hold almost immediately upon Tutankhamen's ascension can be seen from the fact that he changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamen. The Aten element in his original name refers to the Aten worshipped by Akhenaten, during whose reign Tutankhamen was born.
He must have been really young.
Yeah.
And he probably was coerced into doing that.
Yes, I think I had something to do with that. As an influence. The Amen element signified the god Amen, the Theban god, whose cult was the chief target of Akhenaten's religious revolution. The book of Exodus alleges that Moses fled Egypt because after he killed a soldier who was cruelly beating a Hebrew slave, he feared he would be put to death when his homicidal deed was discovered. Josephus, however, cites a different tradition. According to his account, political enemies feared that Moses would become Pharaoh and plotted to kill him. Warned of the murder plans ahead of time, Moses fled to safety. Given the coincidence between the date of Moses' flight from Egypt and the death of Smenkhare, Josephus appears to have preserved the true reason for Moses' flight. The death of Smenkhare triggered a political struggle for the throne. Moses, as the key player in Akhenaten's revolution, may have been in line to succeed Smenkhare, but the enemies of Akhenaten seized the upper hand and Moses had to flee with his life. Okay, that's all I have, but I will note that if that Lucas fellow that I read last week puts Moses as a brother, the heir apparent of the throne, and also as a descendant of Joseph. So that could, if you work that theory in with this theory, it's really interesting. And I think that's the way I'm leaning towards. But yes, we do need to prove a whole bunch of this theory he has about the 400 years and the 430 years. But it's plausible.
And that's Greenberg's book?
Yes, the Moses Mystery. Here,
the Moses Mystery. I see. I think that's in my to-do or wish list. Is there any way that you could copy off those pages?
Sure.
Take pictures of them and put them up so we can see them. I'd love to go through that and try to make some more sense of it.
Sure, I can do that. It's neat. Well, is that legit? Can I do that?
You can do it for an excerpt like that as long as you put the source in.
Okay, I'll put it up in the group. Is that all right?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, very good.
All right. Any comments? Well, that takes our time for tonight then. We'll get back again next Wednesday night. Very good, Allyson. Did a great job. I remember when you were scared to death to give a presentation. Well, you come a long way, baby.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.